In Caligula's first 3 months, Rome celebrated by sacrificing an estimated 160,000 animals, a number so obscene it stops being religion and becomes logistics. Not faith, not tradition. A mass receipt paid to manufacture belief. So here's the question that Rome never dared to print in law. Who paid for a living god? And who profited from pretending he was real? We're not chasing rumors. We're following the paper-thin line where ritual becomes policy. Bonuses, temples, bridge building, and taxes that tighten like a noose. Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Rome loved to call itself rational, a civilization of law, of precedent, of marble order. But Caligula's story begins with an inconvenient truth the Romans kept proving and then denying. Empire is a marketplace of belief. Power doesn't simply rule. It gets staged, funded, and renewed publicly until the crowd mistakes participation for virtue. The man entering this marketplace is not the caricature yet. He is Gaius Caesar, young, handsome, and wrapped in a name the city still worships, Germanicus's son. Germanicus wasn't only admired, he was dangerously beloved. And when he died, the message to his family was unmistakable. Love is not protection in Rome. Love is pressure. Love is suspicion. Love is a reason for the state to remove you before the crowd can turn you into an alternative. Gaius grows up inside that lesson. A childhood on the frontier among soldiers who nicknamed him Little Boots. Then a youth spent watching his household get dismantled by imperial politics. Exile, isolation, the slow administrative violence that doesn't need a public execution to destroy you. By the time he returns to Rome, he has mastered the essential imperial skill, not reacting. In a palace, emotion is evidence. Evidence gets you killed. So when Tiberius dies in 37, the city doesn't just install a new emperor. It performs a collective exhale. Senators reshape their faces into loyalty. The army waits for coin. The people wait for relief. And Gaius steps into the capital like a man walking onto a stage he's rehearsed for his entire life. At first, he plays mercy with precision. He showers the soldiers with bonuses. He restores exiles. He stages public piety, funeral honors, ceremonial respect, the visible gestures that tell Rome the nightmare is over. He gathers the ashes of the dead and returns them to the city as if he can reverse time itself. These aren't sentimental acts. They are calculated investments. Buy the army, soothe the crowd, reassure the elite, then let the machine run. And the machine rewards him, because it wants to believe in the performance. That is the real hinge of this story, not whether one man becomes monstrous, but how fast a civilization can be trained to treat an emperor's inner life as public law. Once Rome slaughters 160,000 animals to celebrate him, it has already crossed the moral threshold that matters. It has agreed, at scale, that reality can be manufactured if the ritual is expensive enough. So keep your eye on the receipts, the money, the ceremonies, the applause. Watch how gratitude becomes expectation, how celebration becomes leverage. Because the question isn't whether Gaius will become Caligula. The question is, who built the stage that makes that transformation profitable? And why Rome will keep clapping even after it starts to understand what it's applauding. Before Rome ever feared him, the army laughed with him. On the Rhine frontier, the empire felt less like marble and more like mud. The air was wet leather, pine smoke, and iron. Men slept in rows. Men marched in rows. Men died in rows. And in the middle of that machine, a child was dressed in a tiny soldier's outfit. Miniature boots, miniature belt, miniature seriousness. And the legions called him Caligula, Little Boots, a mascot for a system that wanted to believe its future was predictable. That nickname is not cute if you stare at it long enough. It is the sound of an institution claiming a child. Rome's army did not merely defend borders, it manufactured loyalty. It trained bodies to obey. It trained minds to accept that discipline is morality. A child raised there learns a brutal grammar early. Affection is conditional. Safety is temporary. And power is whatever stands behind you when the crowd changes its mind. His father, Germanicus, was the kind of man crowds make dangerous, not because he rebelled, but because he was loved. Rome adored him with the unstable hunger it saves for heroes, men whose names feel like relief. In an empire that pretended to be a republic, popularity wasn't harmless. It was a shadow government made of emotion. The more the people loved Germanicus, the more the palace had to fear what that love could become. Then Germanicus died in 19. The sources argue, whisper, accuse, illness, fate, poison, conspiracy. But for the boy, the mechanism is what matters, not the diagnosis. His father is suddenly absent, and Rome's most important lesson arrives in the form of procedure. The funeral, the pyre, the official lamentations. Everything looks lawful, dignified, controlled. And yet, the rumor spreads anyway. The state kills what it cannot comfortably control. If you're looking for the moment Caligula's psychology fractures, it's not one dramatic scene. It's the slow realization that law in Rome is often just violence with good handwriting. His mother, Agrippina, refuses to accept the story quietly. She insists on blame. She drags grief into politics. And Rome punishes that instinct the way Rome always does, by turning a family into a problem to be solved. It doesn't need a public execution. It has quieter tools: exile, confiscation, isolation, starvation disguised as custody, disgrace disguised as prudence. Over the next years, the household is dismantled piece by piece. His brothers are removed from the board. His mother is sent away. The family name, once the brightest asset in Rome, becomes a warning label. This is what imperial politics does to bloodlines. It turns them into paperwork. A person becomes a file becomes a threat becomes an absence. And in the middle of that slow catastrophe, Caligula survives. That survival is the most terrifying part, because it requires a talent Rome rewards: self-erasure. He learns not to look like a rival, not to look like a victim, not to look like anything at all. In a palace, emotion is evidence. Evidence gets interpreted. Interpretation gets you killed. So the boy becomes unreadable. Later, a historian would summarize it with a line that feels like a curse. Never was there a better servant, never a worse master. It is not a moral diagnosis. It's a description of training. Caligula is taught how to disappear in plain sight. Think about what that does to the mind. If your family is punished for speaking, you learn silence as religion. If your brothers vanish after being labeled dangerous, you learn that innocence is irrelevant. If your mother starves on an island while Rome calls it justice, you learn that words like law and order are costumes worn by whoever holds the knife. This is how trauma becomes political intelligence. It doesn't just hurt you, it teaches you what humans will accept. And then, when he is old enough to matter, Tiberius calls him to Capri. People sometimes frame this as mentorship, as though emperors pass wisdom down like fathers. But in Rome, proximity is rarely affection. It is control. Tiberius is not inviting Caligula into a family. He is pulling him into a cage. If the legions once adored little boots, then keeping him close keeps him harmless. If his name is still magic to the crowd, then keeping him under watch keeps that magic from turning into momentum. So, Capri becomes a finishing school in fear. A court is not a home. It is a room full of traps disguised as banquets. It is flattery that tests your vanity. It is jokes that test your temper. It is compliments that test whether you believe them. It is silence that tests whether you can survive being ignored. And Caligula, who has already watched a family die by slow administrative cruelty, does what the smartest hostage does. He performs compliance until compliance looks like personality. This is where the empire makes its mistake. It confuses his stillness for loyalty. It confuses his politeness for stability. It confuses his mask for a face. But masks don't disappear. They wait. And by the time Tiberius grows old and suspicious, by the time Rome starts whispering again about succession, Caligula has learned the one skill that turns a traumatized survivor into a catastrophic ruler. He knows exactly how much humiliation a human being can swallow before they break, and exactly how to make them swallow it anyway. The question isn't whether he will change when power is finally placed in his hands. The question is, what happens when an empire that worships order crowns a man whose entire education was learning that order is just fear with ceremony, and that the only safe way to live inside it is to become the ceremony's author? Because Tiberius is dying. When Tiberius dies in 37, Rome reacts the way exhausted systems always react. It calls the next man salvation, before it has even checked what he is. The news moves like fire through alleys and porticos. People don't celebrate because they understand Caligula. They celebrate because they hate what came before. Years of suspicion, prosecutions, informers, the slow, breathless feeling that one wrong word could turn into a charge. Under that kind of pressure, any new ruler becomes a blank surface for the public to paint its hopes onto. And Caligula arrives with the one pigment Rome can't resist, the bloodline of Germanicus. This is the first lie the empire tells itself in the open. That virtue is hereditary, that a beloved father guarantees a merciful son, that a name can substitute for a record. Caligula understands this lie immediately because he has lived inside it. He knows what Rome wants from him in the first act. Not policy, not administration, reassurance. So, he gives the city the performance it craves, and he does it with ruthless intelligence. He begins with the military, because Rome's morals are negotiable, but its security is not. Bonuses and gifts to the praetorians and the legions come first. Not as charity, never that, but as a contract. The message is simple. Your loyalty will be rewarded, and your reward will be immediate. An empire can survive a hated senate. It cannot survive a disloyal guard. Then he moves to the public. The crowd is not an audience in Rome. It's a force. It topples reputations. It spreads rumors. It turns men into threats. Caligula buys that force with distributions, coin and spectacle, a tangible sign that the new reign is not merely different, but generous. He makes the city feel, physically, that the nightmare has ended. Money is not just money here. It is a ritual object. It is proof that the emperor sees you. And then, he makes his most important early decision. He flatters the institutions that will one day hate him. He treats the Senate with outward respect. He speaks like a partner, like a first citizen, like the Republic's ghost still lives in the marble. It is a calculated restraint. Augustus had taught Rome the trick: rule like a king, but talk like a servant of tradition. Caligula, trained for years to wear a mask, wears it perfectly. He even does something that should seem psychologically impossible if you tell this story as simple revenge. He honors Tiberius. Funeral rites, public dignity, the language of continuity. Not because he forgives, because he understands that Rome fears instability more than it hates hypocrisy. He gives the old emperor the kind of death that makes the state feel clean. He disinfects the transition. At the same time, he turns back to his own family and performs grief like a legal claim. He sails to the places where his mother and brothers died and brings back their ashes for proper rites. On the surface, it looks like tenderness. Underneath, it is power. He is announcing, the previous regime's cruelty is finished, and I am the one who can restore what it tried to erase. He makes himself the bridge between Rome's shame and Rome's hope. This is why the honeymoon is so dangerous. It isn't fake. It works. For a brief moment, the empire feels lighter. Trade hums. The public mood warms. The treasury, swollen by Tiberius's frugality, seems deep enough to finance a new golden age. Roman writers describe a city electrified by relief. Even observers outside Italy speak of expectation, prayers for prosperity, a sense that the world has turned a page. But notice what's happening structurally. Caligula is not simply ruling. He is teaching Rome how to relate to him. He is conditioning the public to expect gifts, conditioning soldiers to expect payoffs, conditioning senators to accept that their dignity depends on his mood. This is not only generosity, it is dependency as policy. It is the empire learning, again, the oldest political truth. A crowd that receives benefits can be trained to tolerate almost anything, especially if you keep the benefits public and the costs invisible. And then comes the number that turns celebration into an accounting problem. In his first months, Rome sacrifices an estimated 160,000 animals in honor of the new emperor. Whether you take the figure literally or as rhetorical exaggeration, the point is unmistakable. This isn't spontaneous love. This is a state-scale operation. Priests, suppliers, transport, slaughter, ritual labor, an entire logistical chain devoted to manufacturing belief. Religion stops being theology and becomes infrastructure. That's the hinge. Because once you build an infrastructure for worship, you also build an infrastructure for fear. The same crowds that clap can be directed to punish. The same priests who bless can be ordered to certify. The same Senate that praises can be forced to kneel. So here is the uncomfortable reality. Caligula's early reign doesn't just reveal his charisma. It reveals Rome's vulnerability. The empire wants a savior so badly that it helps assemble the costume and then congratulates itself for seeing divinity. Which raises the question that should make your stomach tighten. If Rome is already paying this much to believe, what happens when the emperor learns he can raise the price? Because the honeymoon ends quickly, and when it ends, the generosity becomes expectation. The expectation becomes leverage, and leverage becomes a noose. In late 37, Caligula falls violently ill, and when he rises from that bed, Rome will realize it has been applauding the wrong thing. Not a man, not a policy, but a mechanism. One that turns ritual into permission. The honeymoon ends the way most imperial fantasies end, not with a debate, not with a vote, but with a body failing behind curtains. Late 37. Caligula collapses into a severe illness that Rome experiences like a national emergency. The city that had just spent itself manufacturing belief now panics at the idea that its investment might die before it matures. People pray, people bargain, people promise sacrifices, vows, anything. Because when you've built a ruler out of ritual, his heartbeat becomes public property. His survival is no longer personal. It is political. It is financial. It is a referendum on whether the gods are still accepting Rome's payments. He recovers. And every source that matters agrees on the feeling that follows. Something is different. This is where lazy storytelling says, "He went mad," as if madness is a lightning bolt and history is a circus act. But watch the structure. The illness isn't important because it creates a monster out of nowhere. It's important because it becomes a license, a hinge, a before and after that lets the court rewrite the meaning of everything. Cruelty becomes precaution. Paranoia becomes security. Humiliation becomes discipline. Rome doesn't just endure the change. It helps narrate it into legitimacy, the way empires always do, by pretending the new behavior is necessary. The first target is the one thing Rome cannot tolerate near a throne, an alternative. Tiberius, in his will, had named more than one heir. That was the old emperor hedging against chaos, trying to keep succession from becoming a knife fight. Caligula had already maneuvered to sideline the teenage co-heir politically. After the illness, the remaining rival isn't a legal inconvenience anymore. He becomes a story Caligula tells himself about danger. A symbol of the purge that destroyed his own family, a reminder that heirs can be removed, and a warning that someone else could remove him the same way. So the state does what it always does when it needs to erase a person without admitting it has no moral argument. It invents a charge, treason, conspiracy, threats to public order. In a system like Rome's, these accusations don't need to be proven in the modern sense. They only need to be plausible to the people who benefit from believing them. A young man is forced out of the line of succession under the language of law. A rival disappears in a manner made to look official. And the lesson is delivered to the court. The emperor's fear can be translated into policy overnight. This is the point where Caligula stops merely ruling and starts editing reality. He begins appearing not just as a leader, but as an entity above the category of leader. Costumes, iconography, the deliberate blurring of man and God. In Rome, divinity is usually handled like a retirement plan. Emperors can be declared divine after death, once they can no longer use worship as a weapon. Caligula drags the process forward into the present, where it can serve as intimidation. He doesn't want honor later. He wants submission now. And what does the Senate do? It adapts. That's the part people avoid because it makes the story less comfortable. Rome's aristocrats were not naive children trapped in a fairy tale. They were experienced predators. They had survived Tiberius by learning the choreography of fear, when to praise, when to stay silent, when to accuse someone else first. They know exactly what's happening, and they still participate because participation is how you stay alive in a room that has forgotten it is supposed to contain limits. Caligula turns that room into a stage. The Senate's dignity becomes a prop. He can move around to prove ownership. You can humiliate elites without bloodshed. All you need is to force them into roles that make their status look ridiculous. Running errands, performing attendance, becoming furniture at feasts. The humiliation is not random cruelty. It is a legal ritual of dominance. He is demonstrating that their rank exists only because he allows it. This is how a mad emperor becomes a system problem. Because a system can survive one cruel man. What it can't survive is the normalization of the new rules. After the illness, the rules change quietly. If the emperor's mood can remove an heir, then no position is secure. If the emperor can demand worship, then truth becomes optional. If the Senate can be publicly degraded and still return the next day, then the Republic's ghost is officially dead. It's just that nobody has the courage to announce the funeral. And under all of it, the arithmetic starts to mutate. Generosity in the honeymoon stage feels like mercy. After the illness, the same generosity becomes expectation. Bonuses turn into recurring costs. Spectacle turns into an operating budget. Worship requires infrastructure, priests, temples, ceremonies, supply chains, and supply chains require money. When the emperor's identity becomes a public project, the empire must pay to keep that identity convincing. So the state begins to tighten. Not with one dramatic tax decree, but with the slow squeeze that people feel and then get used to. Confiscations framed as justice, auctions framed as efficiency, extraction framed as duty. The noose is not only around the poor, it's around everyone who has something the state can rename as available. When belief needs funding, property becomes a moral resource the emperor can claim. This is the moment the story stops being about Caligula's psyche and starts being about Rome's complicity. Because the real madness isn't that one man starts to believe he is divine. The real madness is that an empire built on law discovers, again, that law can be used to make any belief enforceable, as long as enough people are afraid to say the obvious out loud. And Caligula is about to test the limits of that enforceability in the most dangerous place possible, not in the Senate, not in the streets, but in the sacred. Rome's Senate was not naive. That's what makes what happens next so hard to watch. These men had survived Augustus by pretending he wasn't a king. They survived Tiberius by learning that silence could be a shield. They called it tradition, dignity, the Republic's memory. But those were costumes, useful costumes, meant to convince themselves that the empire still had rules. And after Caligula's illness, he stops treating those costumes with respect. Not because he forgets politics, because he understands politics better than they do. He understands that the Senate is a symbol, and symbols don't have to be executed. They have to be handled. so he begins to use them like stage furniture. At first it's small, a shift in posture, an extended pause, a public joke that forces a senator to laugh at his own humiliation. The Romans built an entire moral universe around status, and Caligula turns status into a lever. He doesn't need to spill blood to break a man. He needs to make the man perform obedience in front of witnesses. The humiliation is the point, because humiliation has a secondary effect. It turns the victim into proof. Everyone watching learns the new boundary without needing to hear it stated. A senator can be made to run alongside a chariot like an attendant. A senator can be made to stand for hours while the emperor eats. A senator can be made to wait, to fetch, to applaud, to pretend that what is happening is normal. It sounds petty until you understand the mechanism. Caligula isn't merely insulting individuals. He is rewriting the meaning of office. He is teaching Rome that rank is not anchored in law or ancestry. It is anchored in his pleasure. And the Senate participates. Because participation is survival. The moment you refuse to play your role, you stop being a senator and become a problem. And Rome has an ancient solution for problems. Rename them as criminals. Treason is not a crime category in this world. It's a political tool. It is the emperor's ability to translate displeasure into a charge. So the aristocracy does what aristocracies do under pressure. It chooses dignity in private, obedience in public. That choice has a cost, not a poetic cost, a structural one. Every time the Senate returns after being humiliated, it certifies the humiliation as acceptable. Every time it claps, it ratifies the new religion, that the emperor's inner fantasy is more binding than anyone else's reality. This is how tyranny becomes ordinary, by being repeated until the extraordinary stops feeling new. Caligula's next move is to widen the stage, to turn personal identity into public policy. He starts appearing in the visual language of the gods, not as metaphor, but as demand. In Rome, the line between politics and religion was never clean. The state used rituals to glue the world together: oaths, sacrifices, priesthoods, sacred calendars. A citizen might not love the government, but he could be trained to fear offending the gods, and the government loved that fear. Caligula hijacks that wiring. He wants temples, priests, altars, sacrifices directed to him now, while he is alive. This is a rupture. The earlier emperors understood the genius of restraint. Act supreme, but keep the claim modest. Let divinity arrive after death, when it can't be used as a weapon. Caligula drags the weapon into the present. He wants the city to practice obedience as worship. And again, Rome complies, because compliance is what empires do when faced with uncertainty. People hate risk more than they hate lies. A senate that fears chaos will swallow almost anything if it means the legions stay calm and the grain ships keep arriving. Then, in late 37 or early 38, the story adds a new kind of fuel: grief. His sister Drusilla dies, and the sources describe Caligula's reaction as excessive, theatrical, destabilizing. Whether their closeness was ordinary or scandalous is not the point. The political effect is what matters. Caligula takes private loss and converts it into public ritual. He elevates her into divinity, demands recognition, builds a cult around her memory. Look at what he's doing psychologically. He is making the empire speak his emotions aloud. Mourning becomes law. A family relationship becomes a state ceremony. If the ruler can decree that his grief is sacred, then he can decree that his anger is sacred too. And if his anger is sacred, then resistance becomes not just disloyal, but impious. That's how you collapse political disagreement into religious offense. That's how you make criticism feel like blasphemy. The Senate understands this. That's why it's terrifying. They can see the door closing behind them, the way a room gets smaller without walls moving. They begin to behave like men trapped inside someone else's dream. They recite praises with dead mouths. They keep their eyes down. They attend rites that make their own identity feel irrelevant. Because to disagree is to stand up, and to stand up is to be noticed. And to be noticed is to invite the emperor to test you. And Caligula loves tests. The cruelty here is not only what he does, it's how he trains people to watch. He stretches ceremonies. He prolongs audiences. He manufactures moments where the powerful are forced to sweat under his gaze. This isn't random sadism. It's governance by psychological extraction. He is harvesting submission the way Rome harvested taxes, routinely, systematically, as a resource. Meanwhile, the costs keep accumulating. Temples need funding, festivals need supplies, priests need salaries, spectacle needs infrastructure. A living god is not cheap. The empire's early generosity, bonuses, distributions, celebrations, has created expectations that cannot be met without constant feeding. And if you stop feeding, the crowd turns. If the crowd turns, the Senate panics. If the Senate panics, conspiracies begin. So, Caligula accelerates toward the one thing that can silence everyone at once: awe. He starts thinking in projects large enough to swallow doubt. Monuments, ceremonies, feats that make the ordinary citizen feel small and the elite feel irrelevant. He is about to build something so absurd that it can only be interpreted one way, as proof that the emperor's fantasy is stronger than the world. A bridge, not just across water, but across the boundary between human and divine. And to build it, he will need money. Lots of it. Part 6. Spectacle engineering. A normal ruler builds roads to move grain, troops, and taxes. Caligula builds a road to move a story. At Baiae, where the coast curves like a polished blade and the rich come to bathe in luxury, he orders an impossible thing: a bridge across the bay, not of stone, but of ships. Vessels chained together, decks lashed into a floating spine, earth and planks laid on top until the sea itself is forced to pretend it is land. It is not infrastructure, it is choreography. An engineering project designed to make one idea unavoidable. The emperor can command nature to cooperate with his image. And Rome understands the message, because Rome has always understood power when it is expressed in logistics. A bridge like this is not a moment. It is a supply chain. It requires commandeered ships, skilled labor, ropes, anchors, timber, food for the workers, protection by soldiers, and the quiet permission of administrators who know the numbers won't add up but sign anyway. That is the hidden violence of spectacle. It looks like celebration at the surface, but beneath it is forced coordination. Human beings pulled off ordinary work to build an emperor's dream. This is why the madness label is too simple. Madness can be private. This is public. This is bureaucratic. This is a state, proving it will move thousands of bodies and tons of material to flatter one man's delusion. The bridge is not proof that Caligula is irrational. It is proof that the empire is capable of reorganizing reality to match whatever the center demands. And then he rides. Not like an official inspecting a project, like a figure staging a myth. He crosses in ceremonial costume, transforming the bay into a prop and himself into the climax. The crowd watches, and the crowd does what crowds do when they sense danger and opportunity at the same time. It applauds. Because applause is insurance. Applause tells the ruler, I am not your enemy. Applause tells your neighbors, do not single me out. Applause is how you survive when truth becomes hazardous. But the bridge does something deeper. It sets a new price for belief. In the early months, Rome paid with animals and festivals and coins distributed to citizens. That was expensive, but it still looked like tradition. The bridge is different. It is a demonstration that worship is no longer about gods. It is about the emperor's capacity to force the state to obey his imagination. It is divinity measured in logistics. Can you mobilize the empire for an act that produces nothing except awe? This is what power unchecked does to the mind and the system around it. It turns functionality into theater. It replaces governance with proof-of-concept stunts. Not because the ruler doesn't understand practical needs, but because practical needs don't satisfy the hunger that absolute authority creates. Bread is necessary. Awe is addictive. And Rome's elite, those who should know better, help finance the addiction. Because no one wants to be the person who says, this is stupid, when the stupid thing is being guarded by swords. No one wants to be the senator who refuses to attend, the administrator who refuses to sign, the supplier who refuses to deliver. That's how empires hold themselves together during moral collapse. They make refusal costlier than participation. So, the bridge becomes more than a spectacle. It becomes a loyalty test. You can almost hear the calculations in the crowd. If I cheer loudly enough, I will not be noticed. If I praise the project, I will be invited to the next one. If I keep my face neutral, someone will report it. In a culture where accusation is currency, neutrality is suspicious. The safest emotion is enthusiasm, and Caligula learns from that safety. He sees, in real time, how quickly a society can be trained to treat the absurd as sacred. He learns that the boundary between man and God is not maintained by truth. It is maintained by repetition, ritual, and the costliness of the performance. If you build something big enough, people stop asking why. They start asking how. And once they're asking how, you've already won. But every performance has a backstage bill. The empire's treasury is not infinite. Tiberius may have been cautious, even miserly, but even a full vault bleeds if you turn the state into a stage and never close the curtains. Bonuses to soldiers, coins to citizens, festivals, sacrifices, priestly salaries, projects that exist to signal, not to serve. The bridge is a perfect metaphor because it is literally a path made by spending other people's resources on the illusion that the sea has been conquered. And illusions require maintenance. A living God cannot appear cheap. If he is cheap, he is breakable. If he is breakable, the spell fails. So, Caligula escalates. He needs more ceremonies, more proof, more demonstrations that overwhelm doubt before doubt can speak. And that hunger for escalation is where the economic and the psychological fuse into one. Because the moment the treasury tightens, the ruler's imagination becomes a financial crisis. This is where the state shows its true face, not the marble face of law, but the administrative face of extraction. Confiscations begin to look reasonable. Auctions begin to look necessary. Accusations begin to look convenient. If you can label someone disloyal, you can label their property available. And in a system where treason is elastic, availability becomes a choice made by whoever controls the definition. So while the crowd remembers the bridge as a miracle, the accountants remember it as a wound. And wounds demand compensation. The next act is not built on the sea. It's built on arithmetic. Empty vaults, harsher collectors, the empire billing its own citizens for the privilege of pretending their emperor is divine. And when an empire starts squeezing to fund a fantasy, it doesn't just create resentment, it creates enemies. The question now isn't whether Caligula can keep staging miracles. It's whether Rome can keep paying for them without collapsing into revolt. Somewhere, in some province, in some sacred place, where applause is not enough. A bridge across water is impressive. A bridge across arithmetic is impossible. Rome can chain ships together and call it destiny. But it cannot chain numbers. Eventually, the ledger speaks, and it speaks without poetry. Tiberius left a swollen treasury, years of restraint, accumulation, the kind of hoarding that made him hated and, for a moment, made Caligula look generous. But a full vault is not a permanent miracle. It is a temporary cushion. And Caligula has been jumping on it like it will never tear. Because the thing about a living god is that he cannot appear modest. Modesty suggests limits. Limits suggest humanity. Humanity suggests accountability. And accountability is the one substance an emperor like Caligula cannot tolerate, once he has learned that reality can be manufactured through ritual. So the spending continues, not only on festivals and ceremonies, but on the maintenance of awe itself. More games, more distributions, more public displays that keep the crowd entertained and keep the elite off balance. This is how spectacle becomes an economic policy. It doesn't just distract, it reorganizes the budget. It forces the state to prioritize appearances over function, because appearances are what keep people afraid to ask questions. But the empire still needs its boring things. Grain still must move. Ports still must function. Soldiers still must be paid. Roads still must be repaired. And when the treasury thins, those necessities collide with the emperor's appetite for proof. That collision creates the most revealing part of Caligula's reign, the extraction. It doesn't arrive like a single tyrannical decree shouted from a balcony. It arrives like administration, like paperwork, like a series of reasonable measures that anyone in the palace can explain with a straight face. If money is short, then money must be found. And in Rome, finding money often means redefining what belongs to whom. The state has tools for this. It always has. Accusations can be turned into confiscations. Legal charges can be turned into revenue. A man labeled disloyal is not just punished, he is converted into liquid assets. This is why treason is so useful in an imperial system. It is not merely a crime, it is a financial instrument. And Caligula, trained by the cruelty that dismantled his own family, understands the elegance of that instrument. You do not need to invent a new law. You need to decide who the law is for. So the courts become a hunting ground, not openly, Rome is too proud to admit that it runs on predation, but functionally. The same aristocracy that once thought it could manage the emperor through flattery now discovers that flattery has become a tax, and the rate can change without notice. A senator's wealth is no longer a sign of status. It is an invitation. It is proof you have something worth taking. This is also where the auction stories start to appear in the ancient tradition. Tales of imperial sales, of furniture and heirlooms displayed as if the palace itself is being stripped to feed the machine. One famous anecdote claims a senator nodded off during an auction, and Caligula treated each nod as a bid, leaving the man to wake up owning a ridiculous quantity of gladiators. Whether every detail is exact is less important than what the story tells you. Rome believed. The emperor could convert a joke into a bill. He could turn someone's body language into debt. That is the psychological economy of tyranny, where even your face can be interpreted as consent. And while the elite are being squeezed, the broader population feels the tightening differently. Not as one dramatic punishment, but as a slow degradation. Collectors more ruthless, fees multiplied, expectations sharpened. The invisible costs of spectacle become visible in everyday life. When money is diverted to stage divinity, maintenance rots. When maintenance rots, resentment grows. When resentment grows, the ruler needs more spectacle. And the cycle feeds itself like a fire that consumes the house to stay warm. Here is the cruel genius. Caligula keeps the crowd close, even as he squeezes the state. He understands something that the Senate never truly respected. The Roman mob is not merely hungry, it is emotional. It can be guided. It can be seduced. It can be made to feel powerful by watching the powerful squirm. If you can keep the people laughing, cheering, feasting, you can buy time. And time is everything. Time is what allows an emperor to survive the period when the elite are quietly becoming enemies. So the games matter. The feasts matter. Not because they are entertainment, but because they are a political anesthetic. Bread and circuses isn't a slogan. It's a survival strategy for regimes that can't afford honesty. The crowd is paid in sensations, so it won't demand accountability. The elite are paid in fear, so they won't coordinate. And the soldiers are paid in cash, so they won't pick a new master. But even this has a limit, because the state can only extract so much before it creates a different kind of danger, resistance that is no longer private. That's when Caligula begins leaning into the most toxic form of control, unpredictability. A predictable tyrant can be navigated. You learn his habits. You learn which jokes to laugh at, which silences to keep, which gifts to offer. An unpredictable tyrant turns every interaction into a roulette wheel. And roulette makes people nervous. Nervous people whisper. Whispering people conspire. So the palace becomes a place of constant calibration. Who is safe? Who is next? Who has been noticed? The Senate is trapped in an exhausting performance of enthusiasm. The administrators are trapped in the fear of signing the wrong document. The wealthy are trapped in the dread that their fortune is now an accusation waiting to happen. And then Caligula makes the mistake that turns fiscal strain into existential threat. He stops treating worship as a Roman game and starts exporting it into places where the price of pretending is not merely money or dignity, but sacrilege. He begins to demand that the empire's theatre be staged inside other people's sacred boundaries, as if every god on the map is just another mask he can wear. The bridge across Baiae was expensive, but it was still Rome's water. The next performance targets a place that does not belong to Rome's imagination, Jerusalem. And when an emperor tries to invoice a religion for his ego, the bill is paid in something Rome cannot easily control. Not applause, not taxes. Rome could tolerate almost anything as long as it stayed inside Rome's script. A senator humiliated? That's internal theatre. A treasury drained? That's arithmetic. A bay turned into a floating road. That's spectacle. Expensive, but contained. But Jerusalem is different, because Jerusalem is not a stage built by Roman habit. It is a sacred boundary that does not accept improvisation, especially not the emperor's. Caligula's demand is simple in form and catastrophic in meaning. Place his image in the heart of the temple, not in a city square where gods mingle and statues multiply, not in a provincial shrine already tuned to Roman compromise, in the central space that defines Jewish worship as the refusal to worship anything else. This is what absolute power does when it gets bored. It starts confusing can with should. If the empire has trained senators to kneel and crowds to cheer, the emperor begins to assume that all reality is equally negotiable. He stops seeing difference as difference. He sees it as disobedience. The order moves east like a blade wrapped in paperwork. It arrives in the hands of governors and commanders who understand Roman force, and understand, with a clarity that should have terrified them, that force has limits when it collides with belief. Because you can tax a province into poverty, you can recruit its sons, you can punish its elites. But if you demand sacrilege and call it loyalty, you are no longer managing a population, you are lighting a fuse. The Roman official in the middle of this is Petronius, the governor charged with keeping Syria and the regions stable. Petronius is not a saint, he is an administrator. That's why his behavior matters. He recognizes immediately that carrying out the order will not produce obedience. It will produce mass refusal, mass resistance, and eventually mass killing, on a scale that will stain the empire and destabilize the frontier. So, he stalls. He does it the way competent bureaucrats stall, when the command above them is insane, with delays framed as diligence. He speaks of logistics, of timing, of materials, of preparation. He writes letters. He requests clarifications. He buys time not because he is brave, but because he understands that bravery is not the only form of resistance. Sometimes resistance looks like procedure. Sometimes the strongest no in an empire is a yes, but later. This is the part of the story that exposes Rome's real architecture of power. The empire pretends decisions flow cleanly from the center outward. In reality, decisions survive only if the people tasked with enforcing them can make them real. Petronius knows enforcement here means war, so he chooses a third option: delay until the problem changes, until Caligula changes his mind or dies, or the political weather shifts enough to bury the order under a new crisis. Meanwhile, the people respond with something Rome cannot easily digest: collective refusal as ritual. Not a riot, not a mob in the Roman sense, a mass gathering that looks like worship and protest fused together. People come not to bargain, but to declare a boundary. The message is terrifyingly calm. We will die before we help you break this. And that calm is more dangerous than violence, because violence can be punished. Calm conviction spreads. This is where the Mad Emperor story becomes a geopolitical problem. If Caligula forces the statue into the temple, he risks igniting a conflict that will require legions, money, and years to suppress, while his treasury is already bleeding and his elites are already souring. A ruler who measures power in spectacle rarely thinks in second-order consequences, but his administrators do. Petronius does. Local allies do. Everyone who has to clean up the aftermath does. And yet, Caligula insists. Because to retreat would be worse than the war. A living god cannot publicly compromise with a provincial taboo. The entire point of divinity is that it does not negotiate. If he bends here, the Senate learns he can be bent. The provinces learn refusal works. The crowd learns the spell has limits. The emperor's identity, this costly manufactured thing, is suddenly revealed as just another political position. So he doubles down not out of strategy, but out of necessity. Once you make your ego the constitution, every challenge becomes existential. Then comes another scene that should chill you because it is so modern. A delegation arrives to plead. Philo of Alexandria describes going with envoys, hoping the emperor will protect their community and stop persecution. They come with words, with arguments, with the old belief that governance is still something you can reason with. Caligula treats the meeting like background noise. He wanders his gardens. He admires his buildings. He forces them to follow him as he performs indifference. It's not just insult. It's a demonstration of hierarchy. You are not interlocutors. You are scenery. This is the purest expression of unchecked power. It doesn't need to persuade. It needs to be seen, not listening. The empire watches this and learns a terrible lesson. The center is no longer anchored to reality. It is anchored to performance. If the emperor's attention is a ritual act, then governance becomes a form of theater, and the rest of the state becomes a crew tasked with keeping the show from collapsing. But shows collapse when the audience stops believing. And now, for the first time, Rome faces an audience it cannot bribe into applause. It can punish, it can threaten, it can kill. But it cannot make sacrilege feel normal to people whose identity is built on refusing it. That refusal is not merely political, it is ontological. It is who they are. Which means the Judea crisis does something far more dangerous than provoke unrest. It exposes the lie at the center of Caligula's reign. That belief is infinitely purchasable. In Rome, belief could be bought with festivals, coins, and fear. In Jerusalem, belief has a different price, and Rome is not ready to pay it. So Petronius keeps stalling. Letters cross the sea. The statue remains a looming threat rather than a reality. The region holds its breath. The emperor's ego presses down like a hand on a throat. And back in Rome, men who have swallowed humiliation for years begin to understand that the problem is no longer just that Caligula is cruel. The problem is that he is destabilizing the empire's basic contract. The ruler may take money, dignity, even lives, but he must keep the system functioning. A near-holy war is not functioning. It is proof the emperor has started charging the empire for his fantasy in a currency the empire cannot afford. And when Rome realizes its ruler can't be corrected by law, can't be restrained by tradition, and can't be bargained with by governors, there is only one mechanism left. Not debate, not impeachment, a corridor, a password, and a knife. The question is no longer whether Jerusalem will burn. Rome could tolerate almost anything as long as it stayed inside Rome's script. A senator humiliated? That's internal theatre. A treasury drained? That's arithmetic. A bay turned into a floating road? That's spectacle. Expensive, but contained. But Jerusalem is different, because Jerusalem is not a stage built by Roman habit. It is a sacred boundary that does not accept improvisation, especially not the emperor's. Caligula's demand is simple in form and catastrophic in meaning. Place his image in the heart of the temple, not in a city square where gods mingle and statues multiply, not in a provincial shrine already tuned to Roman compromise, in the central space that defines Jewish worship as the refusal to worship anything else. This is what absolute power does when it gets bored. It starts confusing can with should. If the empire has trained senators to kneel and crowds to cheer, the emperor begins to assume that all reality is equally negotiable. He stops seeing difference as difference. He sees it as disobedience. The order moves east like a blade wrapped in paperwork. It arrives in the hands of governors and commanders who understand Roman force, and understand, with a clarity that should have terrified them, that force has limits when it collides with belief. Because you can tax a province into poverty, you can recruit its sons, you can punish its elites. But if you demand sacrilege and call it loyalty, you are no longer managing a population. You are lighting a fuse. The Roman official in the middle of this is Petronius, the governor charged with keeping Syria and the region stable. Petronius is not a saint. He is an administrator. That's why his behavior matters. He recognizes immediately that carrying out the order will not produce obedience. It will produce mass refusal, mass resistance, and eventually mass killing, on a scale that will stain the empire and destabilize the frontier. So he stalls. He does it the way competent bureaucrats stall when the command above them is insane, with delays framed as diligence. He speaks of logistics, of timing, of materials, of preparation. He writes letters. He requests clarifications. He buys time not because he is brave, but because he understands that bravery is not the only form of resistance. Sometimes resistance looks like procedure. Sometimes the strongest no in an empire is a yes, but later. This is the part of the story that exposes Rome's real architecture of power. The empire pretends decisions flow cleanly from the center outward. In reality, decisions survive only if the people tasked with enforcing them can make them real. Petronius knows enforcement here means war, so he chooses a third option: delay until the problem changes. Until Caligula changes his mind, or dies, or the political weather shifts enough to bury the order under a new crisis. Meanwhile, the people respond with something Rome cannot easily digest: collective refusal as ritual. Not a riot, not a mob in the Roman sense, a mass gathering that looks like worship and protest fused together. People come not to bargain, but to declare a boundary. The message is terrifyingly calm. We will die before we help you break this. And that calm is more dangerous than violence, because violence can be punished. Calm conviction spreads. This is where the mad emperor story becomes a geopolitical problem. If Caligula forces the statue into the temple, he risks igniting a conflict that will require legions, money, and years to suppress, while his treasury is already bleeding and his elites are already souring. A ruler who measures power in spectacle rarely thinks in second-order consequences, but his administrators do. Petronius does. Local allies do. Everyone who has to clean up the aftermath does. And yet Caligula insists, because to retreat would be worse than the war. A living god cannot publicly compromise with a provincial taboo. The entire point of divinity is that it does not negotiate. If he bends here, the Senate learns he can be bent. The provinces learn refusal works. The crowd learns the spell has limits. The emperor's identity, this costly manufactured thing, is suddenly revealed as just another political position. So he doubles down, not out of strategy, but out of necessity. Once you make your ego the constitution, every challenge becomes existential. Then comes another scene that should chill you because it is so modern. A delegation arrives to plead. Philo of Alexandria describes going with envoys, hoping the emperor will protect their community and stop persecution. They come with words, with arguments, with the old belief that governance is still something you can reason with. Caligula treats the meeting like background noise. He wanders his gardens. He admires his buildings. He forces them to follow him as he performs indifference. It's not just insult. It's a demonstration of hierarchy. You are not interlocutors. You are scenery. This is the purest expression of unchecked power. It doesn't need to persuade. It needs to be seen, not listening. The empire watches this and learns a terrible lesson. The center is no longer anchored to reality. It is anchored to performance. If the emperor's attention is a ritual act, then governance becomes a form of theater, and the rest of the state becomes a crew tasked with keeping the show from collapsing. But shows collapse when the audience stops believing. And now, for the first time, Rome faces an audience it cannot bribe into applause. It can punish, it can threaten, it can kill. But it cannot make sacrilege feel normal to people whose identity is built on refusing it. That refusal is not merely political, it is ontological. It is who they are. Which means the Judea crisis does something far more dangerous than provoke unrest. It exposes the lie at the center of Caligula's reign. That belief is infinitely purchasable. In Rome, belief could be bought with festivals, coins, and fear. In Jerusalem, belief has a different price, and Rome is not ready to pay it. So Petronius keeps stalling. Letters cross the sea. The statue remains a looming threat rather than a reality. The region holds its breath. The emperor's ego presses down like a hand on a throat. And back in Rome, men who have swallowed humiliation for years begin to understand that the problem is no longer just that Caligula is cruel. The problem is that he is destabilizing the empire's basic contract. The ruler may take money, dignity, even lives, but he must keep the system functioning. A near-holy war is not functioning. It is proof the emperor has started charging the empire for his fantasy in a currency the empire cannot afford. And when Rome realizes its ruler can't be corrected by law, can't be restrained by tradition, and can't be bargained with by governors, there is only one mechanism left. Not debate, not impeachment. A corridor, a password, and a knife. The question is no longer whether Jerusalem will burn. If the Jerusalem crisis shows the limits of Roman theatre, the northern campaigns show something worse. What happens when theatre becomes the army's daily work? Rome's soldiers were not extras. They were the most expensive, most dangerous institution in the empire. Men who had marched under Augustus, endured Tiberius's paranoia, and learned to treat discipline as identity. You can humiliate senators for sport. Senators don't hold the swords. But the army is different. The army has a memory. The army has pride. And the army has a quiet threshold beyond which it stops performing obedience and starts considering replacement. Caligula seems to forget this, either because he truly believes his own divinity, or because he mistakes the army's training for infinite patience. He begins to use troops as props the way he uses the Senate, not for conquest, but for demonstration. And demonstration is a dangerous thing to ask from professionals whose entire culture is built on results. So, the empire gets scenes that read like absurdity until you understand their political function. Marches that feel performative. Declarations that sound like jokes but land like insults. Soldiers ordered to behave as if a staged moment is a real victory. The famous image, men collecting seashells on a cold shore as spoils, is not merely comedy. It is a ritual humiliation aimed at the only group in the empire capable of ending his reign without a debate. This is how Caligula governs, by turning everything into a loyalty test. He forces the military to validate his narrative, not because he needs the shells, because he needs the submission. If veterans who have survived real wars will kneel to a fake one, then he has proven something more valuable than conquest. He has proven that his imagination can command reality, even inside the most practical institution Rome has. But the cost of forcing professionals to fake triumph is that you corrode what keeps them loyal. Soldiers can endure hardship. They can endure low pay for a time. They can endure the cruelty of commanders. What they cannot endure forever is the sensation that their honor has been converted into a joke. And honor, in Rome, is not an abstract virtue. It is social currency. It is the thing that tells a man he matters. Strip that away, and you don't just create resentment. You create the desire to correct the world. At the same time, the finances continue tightening. Spectacle requires funding. Funding requires extraction. Extraction requires enforcement. So, Caligula leans harder on fear and unpredictability to keep the system from resisting. He increases his guard. He becomes more paranoid. He changes routines. He sleeps in different rooms. He makes the palace feel like a hunted animal. But paranoia does not stabilize a regime. It advertises weakness. It tells everyone watching that the emperor expects betrayal, meaning betrayal is now imaginable. And once betrayal is imaginable, it becomes thinkable. And once it becomes thinkable, it becomes a plan. The Praetorian Guard sits at the center of this pressure. They exist to protect the emperor, but they are also the closest witnesses to his moods, his humiliations, and his cost. They are the ones who see the fear behind the performance when the doors close. They are the ones who have to execute the daily rituals of security that keep the myth alive. And Caligula, who cannot tolerate any other male authority existing without being reclassified as inferior, chooses to grind them down psychologically. This is where Cassius Caria enters as more than a name. He becomes a symbol of what Caligula doesn't understand, that humiliation has a shelf life. Caria is an officer, an experienced man with command presence, the kind of figure a regime should treat carefully. Caligula treats him like a toy, public mockery, deliberate insults, attacks on masculinity and dignity. The point is not personal comedy. The point is dominance. The emperor is demonstrating daily that even the head of his protection can be made small at will. But dominance is not the same as safety. Dominance creates humiliation. Humiliation creates hatred. Hatred, when combined with access, becomes inevitable. Then comes the rumor that makes the elite's blood run cold. The idea of moving the capital to Alexandria. Whether Caligula ever made a formal plan or simply voiced it as a threat, the effect is what matters. For Rome's ruling class, the capital is not just a city. It is the engine of their identity, wealth, and leverage. The Senate's power is already a costume, but Rome as the center is the one thing that keeps the costume worth wearing. Alexandria represents replacement. It represents a new cultural gravity, an imperial court that doesn't need Roman aristocrats as co-stars. It represents the ultimate humiliation, being made provincial in your own empire. And that is when private resentment turns into collective fear. Because elites can survive a tyrant if the tyrant stays predictable and stays in Rome. They can whisper, adapt, wait him out. But a tyrant who threatens to shift the center of the world threatens their very existence. He turns their patience into urgency. So, the circle of the offended widens. Senators who have swallowed insult. Knights who have watched fortunes become targets. Soldiers who have been used as props. Praetorians whose commander has been mocked into rage. Administrators who have been forced to sign off on madness and then asked to pay for it with other people's property. The regime begins to feel heavy, like a roof that will collapse, not because one beam breaks, but because every beam has been overburdened for too long. Caligula senses it. That's what makes the final months so tense. He increases security. He grows suspicious. He lashes out in uneven bursts. But unpredictability, again, is not protection. It is gasoline. It makes everyone around him more nervous. And nervous people do what Rome has taught them to do for generations. They seek safety by attaching themselves to the next outcome. That is the quiet engine of conspiracy. Not ideology, not heroism, calculation. Because by now the question is no longer, is Caligula unstable? Everyone has accepted that he is. The question is procedural. What is the empire's lawful mechanism to stop a ruler who has turned law into costume and ritual into coercion? There isn't one. The Senate cannot vote him out. The people cannot remove him. Governors can stall and delay, but they cannot override. The law is written to serve the emperor, not restrain him. The empire has built itself like a machine with only one emergency brake: violence. So the men closest to the emperor begin to think like engineers faced with a runaway mechanism. They stop asking whether it is moral. They start asking whether it is necessary. They begin mapping corridors, schedules, guard rotations, festival days. Because assassination is not a burst of rage. It is logistics. And the most chilling part is this. Caligula has trained them for it. He has taught them that ritual is power, that the right moment matters more than the right argument, that public theatre is how reality is decided. So they decide to use his own logic against him, to pick a day of spectacle, a place of ceremony, a moment when the emperor is exposed by the same confidence that has protected him. The stage is set for the empire's only solution. Assassination sounds like chaos. In Rome, it was paperwork without ink. By the end of Caligula's reign, the decision to kill him isn't born from a single insult or a single terrified knight. It emerges the way policy emerges in a sick system, gradually, through alignment. Different groups who dislike each other begin to share the same conclusion, not because they suddenly become virtuous, but because the emperor has made coexistence with him more expensive than the risk of removing him. That's the detail people romanticize away. Conspiracies are not built from courage. They are built from arithmetic. The Senate has been reduced to a prop. Every public humiliation is a reminder that their social meaning depends on one man's whim. The wealthy have watched the treasury bleed and seen how quickly accusations can become confiscation. Governors have learned that their job is no longer administration, but damage control, stalling imperial orders that would ignite provinces. Soldiers have been turned into actors in fake victories. And the Praetorian Guard, the last professional institution near the throne, has been handled like a punching bag. It's not that everyone suddenly becomes brave. It's that everyone becomes tired. Tired is dangerous. Tired people stop believing in the old strategies. Flattery stops feeling safe. Silence stops feeling sufficient. Waiting stops looking like survival and starts looking like slow suicide. And in Rome, when elites panic, they don't march in the street. They meet in rooms and speak quietly. The conspiracy grows inside those rooms. Cassius Chaerea becomes its spine because he holds what every successful plot needs: access. Not just physical access to the emperor, but procedural access to the emperor. He knows routines. He knows the watchwords. He knows which corridors are crowded and which are narrow. He knows how Caligula moves through public ceremonies and how the guard shifts around him. In other words, he knows the machine. And his personal humiliation matters, not because it alone causes the plot, but because it supplies the emotional glue. A conspiracy without emotion collapses into hesitation. Chaerea's daily degradation gives the plot a face everyone can recognize. It turns a political calculation into something that feels like justice, even to men who are not sentimental. But notice how the plot is described by ancient writers, not as a drunken scheme, but as obsessive planning. Escape routes, backup plans, contingencies on contingencies, agreement about what happens if the emperor survives the first blow, discussion of what happens after, who will control the guard, who will calm the crowd, who will prevent a civil war. This is not the behavior of men acting out of rage. This is the behavior of men who understand that if you remove the emperor and leave a vacuum, the empire will eat itself. So the conspiracy becomes a bureaucratic project, a plan to replace one source of instability with another source of stability fast enough that the public doesn't have time to choose violence. This is the uglier truth about Rome. Assassination is treated as a form of succession management when law is designed to protect the ruler from removal. If a system has no constitutional exit, it will create a physical one. And Caligula has built the conditions for that exit perfectly. He has made the Senate weak enough that it cannot lead. He has made the people dependent enough that they cannot organize. He has made the provinces tense enough that delay feels like danger. So the only institution left that can move quickly is the military, specifically the Praetorian Guard. That is why the plot centers on a festival. Because festivals in Rome are controlled chaos, crowds, movement, noise, ritual. They are moments when the emperor must appear in public to maintain the illusion that he is loved, and moments when security must be present but cannot be absolute. A festival creates narrow passages, backstage corridors, transitional spaces where the ruler moves between the sacred and the theatrical. Those in-between spaces are where a god becomes vulnerable. Caligula announces another grand set of celebrations, another revelation of his divinity, another public proof that he is above ordinary limits. Whether it's framed as honoring gods, honoring himself, or honoring both at once doesn't matter. The pattern does. He is escalating again, trying to drown resentment in awe. For the conspirators, that escalation is now a deadline. If he succeeds in captivating the crowd again, he buys himself time. And time is the one thing the plotters cannot tolerate, because time allows Caligula to discover them. Time allows him to lash out. Time allows him to purge. So, they commit. Here is the paradox of tyrannical systems. The more a ruler tries to make himself untouchable, the more he forces his enemies to treat assassination as the only remaining form of politics. He trains them into it. Caligula tries to protect himself in the way frightened rulers do. More guards, more unpredictability, changing bedrooms, staying alert. But he has created a problem no number of guards can solve: hatred inside the guard itself. A bodyguard who wants you alive is protection. A bodyguard who wants you dead is proximity. And as the plot tightens, you can feel the empire's moral collapse in the details. Men who once debated law now debate timing. Men who once spoke of tradition and now speak of corridors. Men who once performed worship now perform conspiracy. The entire system has shifted from governance to survival engineering. This is where the big question grows teeth. If Rome is the empire of law, why is it planning murder like a civil service task? Because Rome's law was never designed to restrain the emperor. It was designed to restrain everyone else. It was a ledger of obedience, not a constitution of limits. Once Caligula takes that ledger and writes God next to his own name, the state has no lawful vocabulary left to say no. So it prepares a different vocabulary: steel, speed, and silence. All that remains is to choose the moment when the emperor will be most exposed by his own confidence, and to choose the phrase that will become the last irony of his reign. A password, one word, a god's name. The end doesn't look like thunder. It looks like routine. That's the detail that should make you uneasy. Rome kills its living god the way it processes any other administrative problem. Quietly, efficiently, in a place designed for movement rather than drama. January 24th, 41. A festival season. Crowds. Performances. Noise thick enough to swallow sudden screams. Caligula has staged these spectacles to prove something about himself, to make the public rehearse belief, until belief feels inevitable. And as always, he has to move through the machinery of his own show, between halls, backstage corridors, narrow passages where ceremony transitions into control. Those passages are the empire's true architecture. Not the temples, not the Senate, not the marble facades. The corridors are where power becomes physical. Caligula is walking through one of them when Chaerea approaches, not as a rebel, as an officer, as part of the daily rhythm of protection. That's what makes the moment lethal. The emperor has trained himself to accept the presence of men he humiliates. He sees them as furniture. He sees them as instruments. He forgets that instruments can be turned. Caligula asks a standard question, something banal, procedural, designed to keep a system consistent. The watchword, the day's password, a small ritual that makes the guard feel like an institution rather than a mob. Caligula answers with a word that reveals the entire pathology of his reign. Jupiter. Not strength, not victory, not security. Jupiter, the king of the gods, the divine father, the name that puts him in the same sentence as the highest authority in the Roman sky. It is the perfect summary of the transformation. A man who began as Germanicus's son now speaks as if he is the god's equal. And in that instant, the show ends. The first strike is fast, not cinematic, not a grand duel. A blow delivered in a space where movement is limited and witnesses are confused. Then others join, not because they are brave, but because they are committed. In conspiracies, hesitation kills conspirators. Everyone has to move at once to prevent the guard from splitting into factions, to prevent the emperor from reaching open space, to prevent the moment from turning into a civil war in miniature. The most horrifying part is what doesn't happen. The Praetorian Guard does not surge forward as a unified wall to protect him. There is no heroic rescue. The institution meant to keep him alive fractures into silence and complicity. Even those not in the plot hesitate, confused by the speed, the authority of the attackers, the sudden realization that the emperor's body is not sacred. Only the story around it was. This is how you know the spell has broken. A god bleeds and the world doesn't end. The noise of the festival nearby continues. That's another cruelty. The city is celebrating. Musicians play. Crowds laugh. Rome's engineered joy becomes a curtain that hides the act of removal. The emperor's death is swallowed by the very spectacle he used to secure himself. The show does not protect him. It muffles him. Then comes the aftermath. Fast, panicked, revealing. The Senate, or at least the senators, taste something they haven't tasted in years. The fantasy of restoration. The word republic flickers back into the air like a candle in a draft. For a moment, they imagine the old costumes can be put back on, that the humiliation can be reversed, or that the empire can return to law, to limits, to reason. But that fantasy lasts only as long as it takes the soldiers to do what soldiers do: secure continuity. Because Rome cannot afford leaderlessness, not with provinces already tense, not with the treasury strained, not with the legions watching. An empty throne is an invitation to chaos, and chaos is the one god Rome fears more than tyranny. So the guard goes looking for a replacement. And here the story turns almost mythic, not because it is impossible, but because it is absurdly literal. They find Claudius hiding behind a curtain, a man long dismissed as awkward, stuttering, scholarly. Not a hero, not a charismatic savior, just a surviving member of the imperial family, available in the moment that availability becomes destiny. The curtain matters symbolically. Caligula lived as theatre. He dies backstage. The next emperor is pulled from behind drapery like an understudy, and the choice is made not by the Senate, not by the people, but by armed men who understand the empire's real constitution. Force first, justification later. Claudius is proclaimed. The machinery clicks back into place. The city, stunned, adjusts. It has practice adjusting. It has been adjusting for decades. A new face, a new set of rituals, a new set of lies that will be treated as stability. Now look back at the big question and feel how ugly the answer is becoming. Rome did not lose control because one man went insane. Rome lost control because it had no lawful mechanism to say stop to the performance it helped finance. It had no institution strong enough to correct a ruler who treated ritual as policy and policy as personal fantasy. So, it used the only mechanism left: assassination performed like procedure. And Caligula's final humiliation is not death. It is what comes after, the speed with which the empire moves on. The man who demanded worship is gone, and within hours, a new worship has been arranged. The crowd will cheer again. The Senate will flatter again. The priests will adjust the language of reverence again. The same system that manufactured a living god proves it can manufacture another ruler just as quickly. Which leaves one last question, the one Rome tries to bury under quick cremation and new ceremonies. If the empire can replace the god overnight, what exactly was divine about him? Rome wanted Caligula's story to end the way it ended his body, quickly, quietly, and without witnesses lingering too long. Because a dead emperor can be framed. A dead emperor can be blamed. A dead emperor can be used like a sponge to soak up the empire's shame. He was mad. He was uniquely evil. He was an exception. That narrative is comforting. It lets everyone else keep their hands clean. It lets the Senate avoid admitting its cowardice was policy. It lets the crowd avoid admitting its applause was currency. It lets the bureaucracy avoid admitting it built the stage and signed off on the props. But Caligula is only partly a man in this story. He is also a mirror. And the mirror shows something Rome hated seeing. The empire's stability was never morality. It was coordination. It was the ability to make millions of people behave as if they believed the same thing at the same time, whether that thing was true or not. That's what the early sacrifices reveal. 160,000 animals in 3 months is not simply devotion. It is infrastructure. It is the state teaching the public how to participate in a lie so expensive that questioning it feels like treason. Once you pay that much, you don't want to admit you are buying theatre. You want to believe you are buying order. This is the core of the big question. How did Rome, the empire that worshipped law, end up manufacturing a living god? And why did everyone comply until murder was the only exit? Because Rome's law was never designed to bind the emperor. It was designed to bind everyone else. The Republic's ghost, the Senate, the old language of shared power, was already an aesthetic by the time Caligula arrived. Augustus had perfected the trick. Keep the forms, control the substance. Let the aristocracy keep titles so they don't panic. Let the people keep games so they don't riot. Let the army keep pay so it doesn't choose a rival. Caligula didn't invent that system. He exposed it by pushing it to a grotesque clarity. He treated ritual as policy because Rome trained him to. Emperors were already semi-sacred figures in practice, even if the language was cautious. Caligula simply dragged the implicit into the explicit. He demanded worship while alive and forced the elite to perform submission publicly because he understood the empire's true engine. Humiliation is cheaper than mass slaughter and often more effective. A man who has been made to kneel in front of witnesses is easier to control than a man who has merely been threatened in private. And what did the Senate do? It performed. That is complicity. Not moral failure as an emotion, but moral failure as a repeated behavior. Each time the Senate returned to the chamber after being degraded, it taught Rome that dignity was optional. Each time it applauded, it certified the emperor's fantasy as political reality. Each time it stayed silent to avoid becoming the next target, it widened the radius of what could be done. The crowd did the same in its own register. Bread and circuses is not a lazy cliché here. It is the payment plan. Caligula fed and entertained the public not because he was generous, but because he understood that a population can be trained to trade accountability for sensation. The empire's grandeur wasn't paid in gold. It was paid in attention, in ritual participation, in the collective decision to clap because clapping felt safer than thinking. And the bureaucracy, governors, administrators, collectors, showed the most terrifying truth of all. Even when they understood the danger, they still kept the machine running. Petronius' stalling in the Jerusalem crisis is a perfect example. He delays because he sees the disaster. But notice what he does not do. He does not openly defy the emperor. He cannot. The system does not permit a lawful no. It permits only delay, disguise, and eventually violence. That is the empire's fatal design flaw. It has no internal mechanism to correct a ruler who weaponizes sacred language. When the ruler makes his ego the constitution, the state can either comply or kill. That's why Caligula's assassination looks like procedure. The corridor, the watchword, the blade. It is the empire performing an emergency function. It never wrote into law because writing it would admit the truth. Rome's order depended on the sanity of one man, and the empire had no clean way to survive when that sanity failed. So, what did Rome learn? It did not learn mercy. It learned efficiency. It replaced Caligula with Claudius within hours, not because it had solved tyranny, but because continuity mattered more than principles. The soldiers chose an emperor because soldiers are the only institution that can move fast enough to prevent a vacuum. That choice exposed the final humiliation of the Senate. Even after the god was dead, the Senate still could not truly decide Rome's future. It could only react. And that is the resolution of the big question. As ugly as it is simple, Rome manufactured a living god because the incentives of the empire rewarded the manufacture of belief. Ritual made obedience feel sacred. Money made obedience feel profitable. Fear made obedience feel necessary. And when the performance became unsustainable, when taxes tightened, when provinces threatened to ignite, when the guard itself became the enemy, the system did what systems without exits always do. It didn't reform. It cut the wire. Caligula is not a warning about one unstable ruler. He is a warning about what happens when a society confuses spectacle for legitimacy, when it prices obedience lower than truth, and when it builds a state so centralized that the only check left is violence. And if you want the final bitter irony, the empire that called Caligula a monster continued to use the same tools he weaponized: ritual, propaganda, humiliation, public entertainment, because those tools worked. Rome didn't bury Caligula because it was ashamed of him.